I've always believed in logic. If something sounds weird, it's probably just a logical explanation. Creaks in the floor, old pipes, or a gust of wind rattling the windows. But what I started hearing every night didn't have a logical explanation. It was subtle at first, just faint scratching noises from behind the walls. Nothing alarming. I'd brush it off as the house settling, the old pipes expanding. But as the days went on, it became harder to ignore. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and hear it, scratching. Then a soft tap, 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 like someone was gently knocking on the walls. At first I told myself it was nothing, maybe a mouse or a bird stuck in the attic. But the noises came every night, growing louder, more persistent. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night to hear a muffled sobbing, a soft, pitiful cry like someone was trapped. I told myself it was just the wind or some wild animal trying to get in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was in the walls. The first encounter, one night after a particularly long stretch of sleepless nights, I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not just any breathing. It was slow, heavy, and it felt wrong. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The house was silent except for the breathing, which seemed to come from directly behind the wall at the foot of my bed. I strained my ears. There was no mistaking it. It was steady, rhythmic, like someone was waiting. Then, through the walls, I heard a faint whisper. "Help me." I froze. Was it my imagination? The wind? My mind? I wasn't sure, but the terror in that voice, the desperation, sent a chill through my spine. I lay back down, heart pounding in my chest, staring at the ceiling, hoping to drown out the sound. But it didn't stop. The whisper came again, followed by more muffled crying, and then the scratching. Scratching at the walls, scraping like nails against wood. It went on for what felt like hours, until, exhausted and terrified, I fell back into an uneasy sleep. But the next morning, the noises had only gotten worse. The search for answers. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sounds were too real, too persistent. I needed to know what was causing them. At first, I called an exterminator, thinking there might be animals living in the walls. He came over and checked the house for any signs of infestation. He found nothing. No rats, no squirrels, not even a single rodent. He seemed puzzled, but he reassured me that the house was sound and there was no reason to worry. But the noises didn't stop. The whispers, the breathing, the scraping. They continued night after night until I could no longer sleep. I was losing my grip on reality. It was as though the house itself was alive, and something wanted me to know it was there. So I did what I never should have done. I decided to tear open the wall. The discovery. With a hammer and sledgehammer, I started to break apart the drywall at the foot of my bed. It took hours, sweat pouring down my face as I chipped away at the plaster and wood beneath. I was half hoping that I would find a simple explanation, pipes, wires, anything that would make sense of this madness. But when I finally pulled apart the last piece of drywall, I didn't find pipes or wires. I found a small crawl space, barely large enough for a person to fit in. Inside, curled up in the dark, was a man. He was pale, his clothes torn and covered in dirt. His hands were bloodied from scratching at the walls, desperately trying to escape. His eyes met mine, wide and terrified, and for a moment we just stared at each other, frozen. Then he whispered something so softly I had to strain to hear it. "I've been waiting for you." I stumbled back in shock, my mind racing. The man, he had been trapped in there. For how long? How had he survived? Was he still alive? Then I looked around the crawl space. It was too small for him to have lived in for long. The smell of decay, the dried blood on the walls, the way his skin hung loosely from his bones. It all pointed to one horrifying truth. This man hadn't just been living there. He had been alive in the walls, but only for a short while. As I backed away from the crawl space, I felt something cold brush against my neck. I turned to look, and my blood ran cold. There were more crawl spaces. I had no idea how many people had been trapped in those walls, or how many more were still there waiting to be found. Ending a note, I moved out of that house the very next day. I couldn't live with the thought that someone, was still trapped inside the walls. And to this day, every time I pass an old house with peeling paint and creaking floors, I can't help but wonder how many others there are like mine. How many are waiting? How many are still trapped? And most terrifying of all, how many of them are still alive?